Or can
I can. Recording has begun.
Okay. So again, welcome to our weekly meeting. So thanks to Michael, we now have just one Zoom meeting to join instead of two. First of all, on the agenda, let me provide some progress update on the MVP goal we set up for KubeCon this May. So first of all, the official procedure of establishing this working group is done. So the PR has been merged, and now you can check out the work group information on the SIG list file. So at the moment, the lead contact were the people that helped bootstrap the working group from the offline discussions a couple of times last year, and I was thinking about after KubeCon we could actually have some sort of election or there are new people want to be very active helping the working group, and we could bring more fresh blood into it. So some thought on that. But anyways, we are one of the official working groups now. Okay.
Great.
And
that's excellent news.
As of when are we official?
Huh?
When are we official as of?
February the 3rd, I think that was the day.
Okay. Sorry, I'm new to at least a lot of the control structures around me.
No problem. Me too.
I'm in the same boat as well, so I'm thinking as we go along.
Yeah. So next about the we agreed last time that for the reaching out to the SIGs or working groups, there should be event triggered. So last week or the week before, actually, Dan Cohen and the Linux Foundation folks visiting Huawei. And when I introduced the policy working group idea, I think he's really interested and thrilled about it. And he suggests me to reaching out to Brian Grant, which is like the brain for the Kubernetes community architecture.
To be clear,
excuse me? You have audio problem, Erica. I cannot hear you. Or is it just me?
No, I also cannot hear.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right. Who was it who instructed you to reach out to Brian Grant?
Dan Cohen.
Dan Cohen. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, he suggests that we should at least get aligned with the SIG architecture from early stage, so that we don't digress too much. So I have already sent out an email to Brian. I think I CC some of our colleagues and Michael as well, I believe. So I
don't think I saw that note, but I'd be happy to be on CC for those types of discussions.
Yeah, so I think you should.
I'll be upfront with everyone else, as I had suggested to Howard as well. I am interested in helping to become one of the facilitators for the work group after KubeCon, if folks will are interested in that. But so I just want to be upfront that I'd love to have a role there.
Yeah. So anyways, email sent out and I haven't heard from Brian yet, because he's really busy with the new cloud native definition going on. So, but I think he will review and get back to us. Okay. And the next one, yeah.
Is he the only person in architecture you think we should reach out to?
Well, he's the main lead. He's sitting on the TOC.
Right, but so are a lot of other people.
Yeah, no. Well, Nick, you can also reaching out to people in SIG architecture. You know that, yeah, we should definitely, simultaneously or spontaneously. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. If you get the SIG architecture folks, like, just go for it. Reach out, and that'd be super helpful, I think.
Yeah. I think we shouldn't like surprise them. Like they don't even know what's happening here. Yeah. Okay. So
something specific we could reach out with, just like starter is enough.
At the moment, it's just a shout out, I think. Well, I include the meeting document, the design proposal document in my email to Brian. So
okay.
Yeah, basically just a big shout out. Okay, next for the working group session at KubeCon. So Torian helped send me a link that also Dan Cohen sent out for the working group of 6 to register their official sessions. So I have already registered us for both a deep dive and introductory session. If we were to be approved, I think that would be a very good opportunity for us to be together and discuss face to face. So for deep dive, that'll be like 40 minutes, I think, a session. That would be really great, and get all the related people in the same room. Yeah. So that's all about the progress update.
Who's in charge of whether we get a room at KubeCon or not?
I don't actually know. I think there should be a committee or something. Well, I just submit the form.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Looking good.
Yeah, I think that I remember the CFP exception will be notified sometime like next week.
Right.
Yeah, so we should be able to get some feedback next week or the week next.
Okay.
Yep.
Sounds good.
Yep. Okay, moving on to real business. So the next item is to approve the last meeting's notes impact on the design document. So if Michael could go over to the design doc. Thank you. So I put suggestions there. So these are the paragraphs that based upon the meeting notes last time. So there were like 2 major suggestions. One is to mention the GDPR and those, legislation side of motivations for our work here. And the second was, I can't remember, was it like Ramil's question or Spike's question, that we don't have a clear like set of core problems we want to tackle in the motivation. So I basically put a bullet points there. Yeah. So please review it. If there is no like major problems, then we could merge it and polish it afterwards.
Really, for this part, Howard, at the very end, I think this is by the policy, right? It was ad hoc implementation for the support of policy auditability, where it's required to provide a trail of changes made to the policy, who modified it, or the decisions that were applied by the policy. I mean, maybe another way to phrase that might have been,
I'm sorry, did I miss the end of your sentence there?
no, I started talking to see if I could just type it out real quick and then make it more clear. So if you can see my screen share though, auditability policies which are created, modified, or disabled, as well as the actions performed on behalf of the policies which are applied. And I'll even go back and spell policies correctly. But I would submit that sentence to replace this last bullet.
Yep, that sounds good to me.
Okay.
I think the rest of that looks good.
Yep. So yeah, that'll be the modification based upon last meeting, and then we could carry on for today. Just keep reviewing section 1 and 2. Hopefully finish up section 1 and moving on section 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
When we consider
with,
use cases, do we have a? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Let's first wrap up section 1C for motivation. Anything else we left or we need to mention?
I just want to bring up, so last time we talked, I think maybe it was Spike that was trying to kind of clarify what should go into motivation and what shouldn't. And I think that maybe others can correct me if I'm wrong, but there maybe should be like a separation of like the background and the challenges that exist versus like the goals that the working group has, or the goals as a working group, and the scope of what the working group wants to tackle. Like those seem like three kind of separate things that we should address early on in the document, so that when people come to the document, they can quickly and clearly understand those things. Like what is the state of things in the past, or what was the state of things in the past? What were the main challenges? What are the goals that we like? How do we want to bring that forward? And then what's the scope of the work that we're proposing to do to meet?
So basically, you suggest breaking up section 1 into like background and over.
Yeah. At least splitting out the
and then we have specific scope in section 3.
Yeah, just like at least splitting out the background from the rest of it, just so that it's very clear what the goal of the working group is.
Okay. I think it should be okay.
Well,
anyone
so
else?
Based on that, though, I think, Torin, this last sentence is really a goal, not a current state. Yeah. Lack of big picture is clearly current state. Lack of coordination is clearly a current state. So I think these two, I think we had listed a few others. And in fact, Howard, I think you had originally been capturing notes from that meeting, but I'm not seeing the comments here along the side. And off the top of my head, I don't know, do we have version or other history that we could refer to?
I think
we did actually list out all the bullets.
Yeah, I think there are like history. If you click upon comments, or I can't remember. Well, anyways, what
yeah, we don't have to solve this right at this moment. We just maybe something to think about. When it comes to like the final wordsmithing of the doc.
Yeah, I'm okay. Have like a dedicated background section to begin with, stating the problem and then moving on to the the real motivation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think this is what we had before. So you've got the first two already, and then maybe we kind of merge these a little bit, right? Lack of consistency for extensible policy creation.
So I actually mentioned in the the last sentence, there's no consensus about the preference to an extensible and pluggable architecture.
I agree with that. I agree with that. I think there's a certain symmetry to here are the things that we think are lacking in the architecture.
Okay.
And I think I'm just trying to phrase it to Torrent's point so that it's crisp on what exactly would be there.
Okay.
I think what you have is completely valid. I think I'm just looking to try to take the point that Torrent had made and make sure that we can address it there. Because
Okay,
really
so
this one, instead of
Yeah.
auditability, it's really lack of
of
well.
a consistent implementation of the support, right?
Yeah. And here, I don't know what would be more appropriate, architecture, ecosystem, but I'll go with architecture for the minute.
Yeah. Yeah, looks good to me.
And then I'll delete my copy and paste to that note. And so with that in mind, then I think the next section up for proposal or discussion would we add a subsection for scope or a second section?
No, we'll have a scope. We'll have scope in section 3. So last meeting, I think we will agree that scope would be the most specific items. I think we'll just have the background for section 1 and then motivation for section 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I like that this now has, here are the gaps and limitations that we foresee or that we see right now in the community.
Yeah.
And then this really does, I think, represent the specific motivation. We're trying to establish a work group to provide overall architecture that describes the current policy related stuff, and then moving into use cases and scope from there without necessarily stating the specific goals that I think we would then capture under scope.
Yeah.
And largely, I think the goals are likely to be a mirror image of the 4 critical things we think are lacking.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
All right. And I think actually this part, it's really lack of consistent auditability across the Kubernetes architecture of policies, which are, okay. Torin, Erica, Xuanja, are you guys okay with that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
It looked like a quick thumbs up. Okay. I always get nervous if I just see the one finger. I have to figure out which one it is real quick. You know, it's just trying to match it up. All right. So, use case.
Yeah. Let's move on to use case. So we have the HBO and security infosec was suggest management and compliance. I think this was from Erica, right? Yeah.
I've learned a little bit more about work in the future. And there's still some overlap, a lot about multi-tenancy and being able to manage that sort of stuff.
Well, something
Okay.
as simple as
Yep.
policies about where data which is sensitive to GDPR requirements is stored and managed by each of the components, I think is a gap that's lacking in the platform today.
Yes.
So I think
And
even if
equivalent regulations in China and a couple other countries that some other customers are trying to figure out.
and perhaps it's also a solid fit to build out a strong use case around how we could help the platform support GDPR while we're going to KubeCon EU.
Just in time for it to be enforced, right? So.
Okay. Any like more use cases we could think of for policy?
I think we could come up with more. I think the question is, are we benefited by a broader set of shallow use cases or a smaller set of deeper use cases? And I tend to think if our goal is to show consistency across all the building blocks, we're better served to limit the number, but flesh out more depth.
Yeah, I would prefer we have like specific, like real business scenarios that we could collect for section 2. Not just, functional description of, okay, we need network policy, we need security policy. So we need business,
I
like
completely
business
agree
use
with
cases.
that. So I would think, and maybe let me state what I think the end goal looks like here and try to validate whether Howard and everyone else agrees with it. I would think that this is simply a skeleton upon which we would define a persona, and then we would define what that persona cares about, what are their kind of ongoing challenges and issues that they're trying to basically describe their as-is experience. Then we would describe what their to-be experience would look like. Now, today, for the HBO team, we actually can go back literally to what they presented on stage in Austin, and we can highlight some of the ways that they were trying to cope with those challenges. That gives us a pretty accurate view of as is. And then I think we would lay out, here is what they would be able to do that would be different than before, and here's why it would be better. And then I think we would get into things like defining policies around admission controllers that are time sensitive. I do not want you to deploy a new workload within a certain window when I know I'm about to have to scale out pretty dynamically. Changes to security policies that might affect applications and access to services or other resources. I don't want to allow that within a certain window. Pod scheduling, disabling any pods which aren't critical or that are in namespaces which are kind of deemed as of less significance, like test namespaces or staging or things like that. But I would expect that for each of these, we would then give specific examples of how would this vision that we are trying to create of a broad end-to-end policy framework help that use case for driving very predictable but large spikes in traffic that has to be serviced by the platform. And then for GDPR, I think it would be the same thing. I think today, when you go through a GDPR analysis of the platform, it will be a lot of work for each individual deployer to go through it, each individual consumer of Kubernetes to use the platform. And they'll all kind of go through and do it on their own. But if you wanted to put in certain restrictions about what kind of data were allowed in each of these, so in that case, perhaps things like RBAC, network policy. Network policy is probably the one that to me kind of jumps out the biggest, the most important there, because things like IP addresses and identifiable information, I think, are going to be governed to some extent by GDPR. And then what's in persistent volumes and whether they have to be encrypted or not, things like that might also play a role in being able to highlight, this is a production namespace. Any data that goes in here must kind of fit these parameters, and then try to describe, here's how we would create a policy framework that would support that.
Yeah, for instance, network policy can be defined in some senses, but not necessarily on a cluster level in a way that allows a cluster administrator to really restrict what happens within namespaces. It kind of ties into the multi-tenancy. And that's just like a small example of where the gap is between managing a full cluster and managing policy within it. And we can either think of that as a small little thing that we need to fill in and like correct and have some kind of cluster level network policy, or we can think about it as a larger picture. And each of those kind of have its disadvantages and advantages. And I think we want to, at least in this working group, figure out what the advantages and what we can what the commonality is with other kind of policies that we can tie it together and make extensible.
I agree with that. So Howard, does that meet the expectation or the vision that you had for this section of the document? Or were you envisioning something else here?
I have no problem that we have specific use cases and then break it down to like specific requirements, right? Highlight the the gaps or anything that hopefully this working group could help to address. I think what I want to discuss for section 2 is that I think we still need more use cases, but not that many. So I think we might eventually wind up with maybe 4 use cases, and then we could tackle each of them into specific details that people could see from really high to really low how these things working.
Okay.
Yeah, so my idea is hopefully we could have some of really good use case that each of them could cover one or several areas that we ID'd below, like for RBAC, admission, scheduling, storage, network.
But just to confirm, let's pick on the entertainment one because hopefully that's a little bit simpler. I would expect that as part of this, we're going to define something that helps with some amount of API authentication, some amount of admission control.
So I actually know, I actually know the speaker from HBO to share the topic at KubeCon last year. So I think maybe I could invite him to like give some detailed explanation maybe next week.
Okay.
Does it sound good?
Yeah,
I think that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. I just want to say, like, I feel like it's really good, and like what everyone should do is making sure there's a real use case for these things, and
yeah,
I applaud you for going beyond what many SIGs do at all.
Yeah.
Seems like even caring about this to get to 4 levels is way beyond what I've seen from most features. So thank you.
No problem. Okay. Put down action item for me.
And so just to confirm this idea that we would kind of pick, I think the list below here represents maybe, and there's probably more, but this is sort of the palette of colors that we would select. And then each of these, we're going to paint a picture with just a subset of those colors.
Yeah.
To highlight where they get connected.
Yeah. I think that kind of breakdown could help people really understand what the requirements are.
For GDPR, Erica, you had mentioned network policy. Are there others that you would anticipate here as well?
I mean, maybe sadly, in a lot of the container space, there's very few people who even are aware of GDPR. So I mean, obviously things like storage are important. Perhaps just even auditability is important. I wish I had more information on what people should and shouldn't know, but
It's okay. We can learn that together as we go. So I listed auditability as a topic here. I don't know if this is this driven by policy. Is it likely part of the use case that we would declare a certain kind of audit level for all behavior that goes through the system? And for this, I need to get a little bit deeper on the current audit framework in Kubernetes. Khaled, I wonder, would Young or Dama or someone else be a good person to help provide some depth on that?
Yeah, that's possible. I think to get a little bit deeper in that area.
Okay.
Are you thinking of auditability as kind of a key?
I think based on Erica's comment, I'm hypothesizing would I create a policy specifically around auditability to say that every major action that I perform on a cluster must be auditable versus every fine-grained action must be auditable. So
yeah, I think it sounds like auditability is not in itself a policy so much as it is something necessary to make policy and something we want to make policy about.
And I guess what I'm poking at is that would I define a policy, an auditability policy that says just like a sort of like traceability in your log settings, and maybe it's sort of major, minor, or fine-grained, and then other services in the cluster, whether it's networking services or deployment admission controllers or scheduler or the API server, would actually then watch that policy of how fine-grained they needed to register an audit, provide an audit trail of behavior on it, so that I can say I want all major things auditable. And then the API server, the scheduler, kube proxy, mission controllers, et cetera, they would start then they would respond to that higher level definition of, okay, major events, what's a major event? Each one would define it, must have an audit trail behind them. Or I can go in and set an auditability policy that says, because of my GDPR requirements, I need really fine grained control. So if a pod fails, I want to know about that in the event, and I want to know where it was rescheduled and where was the secret or the config maps or the things exposed during the course of it being rescheduled. And I'm throwing that out as more of a question. Do we think that kind of use case is interesting because it's sort of setting, here's a level of auditability that I want a component to conform to, and then each component would then respond to it and try to provide out that level of detail. Or maybe that's kind of just too far off.
No, I think that's actually really interesting of whether you kind of propose the policy and make the components respond to it versus the other way around, if I get that right.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, the proposing declaratively, doesn't have to be YAML, but whatever, and having the components respond to it is kind of more of the Kubernetes way, but is that actually extensible? Is it hard to say?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have.
Well, here, how about this? I'll move this over to a comment so it doesn't get in the way of the flow. And if we need it later on, we can come back to it.
Yeah, I was just going to say that a lot of these other points that we have here are more around the enforcement point, where the policy is enforced. So we're talking about admission control and API authorization or API authentication. Those are different. I mean, there are different kind of enforcement points basically in Kubernetes today. Scheduling, the pod scheduler, the scheduler is another enforcement point for scheduling policy, and so on and so forth. Whereas auditability is sort of different. It's not really an enforcement mechanism or an enforcement point. You might want to enforce that a certain auditing like policy gets or auditing behavior gets applied. Like for example, like you need to keep audit logs around for a certain amount of time, right? Or you need to be able to expire them, or like you need to audit at a certain like verbosity, like you said. That would be enforced maybe through some other mechanism, like an admission controller or something like that. I think that for
and so really what you're highlighting is sort of policy decision points versus policy enforcement points, and then that being a separate topic of whether or not you provide an audit trail of the decision point and the enforcement point.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So I would imagine that you would have like for example for the geofencing use case or the GDPR use case, having like a log of all the decisions that were made, like the authorization decisions that were made, for example, like or the placement is like the storage placement decision that's made, like would be very important, right? Because if my data was suddenly on a cluster in America and I'm an EU citizen or something, that might be an issue, right? So that's where the auditability kind of comes in my mind.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe like philosophical of a point, but there is a point along policy of making sure that the subcomponents are accurately reporting what we want them to enforce or decide what a policy is.
And just Erica, could you repeat that just real quick? When you talk about the enforcement point there, was it about the extensibility of enforcement points across components?
We are trusting that a component will report back the information that is needed to decide and enforce decision accurately.
Mm-hmm.
And then be able to make sure that is right in past, like in the future, when we look back on decisions. That might be an auxiliary concern from here, but it's interesting.
Okay. Yep, I agree with that.
Okay, so go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to throw out, well, go ahead.
I was just going to suggest that maybe we come up with like a format for these use case sections. And I think, Michael, you kind of already started doing that, but like just talking about, having a skeleton where you've got like the enforcement points that you talk about. We're going to want to talk about the personas, like the people that are the different roles that are involved. We don't have like the roles mentioned. But just showing how it like applies to the developer, the end user versus like the cluster administrator versus like the compliance officer, something like that might be useful.
Yeah, I think that would be a great suggestion. We have a template, right, for the use cases.
Yeah.
So I'll type out, here we go. Let me make sure that everyone understands this is just a suggested idea. So I would think that we'd have the persona. We need to figure out what those are. I think compliance officer completely makes sense. I think cluster operator. I don't know about developer, but at least those would be three that would come to mind out of the gate. I think to some extent, something that would describe what the persona does, feels, says, and thinks as an idea, right? What if you're trying to represent the mindset of this person, how would you represent it? And then a format that we use a lot when we are building up product is sort of this as a role. It's the who, what, wow, and who, what, and wow. So as a role, basically, what do they do, and Why is this awesome? So basically an example might be, as an operator, I can define policies across the entire cluster with 7 YAML files in less than 2 hours or something like that.
Whoa, only 7?
What's that?
Only 7?
Well, something like that. It's more subjective, but if you can capture why it's interesting at the end, that's kind of the point though, is like, what would make this awesome? Like what would make it meaningful and significant, right?
Okay, that was a
And
joke.
so it's okay. But no, it's a fair point, right? What do we think about who, what, and wow as just a list? And these would be titles, and then from here we might have, the different steps, right? Do this, do that, do the other. So as a straw man, at least, something to consider. What other aspects, first off, do you like any of those? I can delete it pretty quickly. Or are there other things that you would want to include in it?
Yeah, so I think we could combine actually the persona and the description. So for example, the HBO use case, we could just describe this is like use case for the entertainment, and how HBO folks are using Kubernetes, and they need policy to do what, and then go into the do this, do that, do the other, and then we need, like what Torrance suggested, we need to kind of ID the, for example, at least the decision point and the enforcement point in that scenario, right?
Okay. Yep.
And follow that will be the list we are putting up now. It's like what components are they currently using for policy? Yeah, API authentication, network. Yeah, so basically break it down to several details.
Now, do you expect that this would actually get down
yeah,
to
so
each of the components that would be involved? Like, here's how the network policy would look, right? Insert YAML.
well, that would be best. At least we should have a list of the policy component they use for the use case. But it would be even better that we could have that level of detail. For example, as you suggested, here's how the network policy actually look like in their practice.
Okay.
Yeah.
That might be like a sub bullet point of the original persona stories. Like the original thing is, I'm this person, I want this, and then some sub points are, and this is how I'm currently doing it in regards to our current technology.
I think so. And in fact, honestly, I think, there's probably one list of personas that would apply to all 4 intended use cases, and completely agree that I think these should also represent what they do today, right? Describe what the persona does today, and think of this as is, right? And then describe how the persona's life is better to be. But I'm happy either way. If this doesn't land, that's fine. We find it often valuable to understand kind of what they do today, and then understand how it's going to improve going forward. Because otherwise, we're kind of discussing it, why we think it's better.
Yeah, I think that this fleshing out the personas the way you've described, Michael, will be really useful when it comes to things like the interfaces that are exposed to the cluster operator and so on. like it's going to be fairly obvious, I think, or it'll be fairly easy to figure out like what are the enforcement points that need to be like configured to achieve the use case. But then like there's this whole question of, well, how do you manage all those different enforcement points? How do you get the policies there? How do you audit them, and so on and so forth? So by listing the personas, we can figure out what's needed from a management point of view, basically.
Okay. All right, so we've got about 8 minutes left. Are there other notes you wanted to capture here? I think inviting the presenters from HBO to come and basically do kind of a persona interview with us to help flesh out the as is, and also to get specific input on where they think the life would be easier if we could do some of this is a great idea. I don't know if you want to try to break some of this up and work some of these offline. Howard, or what would you think?
Yeah, I think it's probably like we can spend some time iterating through a couple of these use cases. I think the government one. I also see. I was talking to a financial services client as well, and they are actually possibly interested in participating in some of these working groups. So maybe we can get them to give some input.
Okay.
That would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I think it would be great if we could have like invited speaker for each of the use case.
Yeah, the
Like
more
yeah.
the more non-vendors we can get in here, probably the better.
This is one of my favorite working groups, though, because it's a smaller group.
Yeah. I think right now it's all vendors. Well, no, sorry, Jean is on the call, but other than that, we're all vendors.
Just small.
Yeah. Okay, so for like more use cases, Torren, do you guys have like any other really interesting use cases you've encountered regarding policy?
We've been talking to some folks about the ability to like lease out capacity to ensure high utilization of resources. But I think that so that's one example. But I think that really we should just stick to these two and try to go for depth on them. I think we can. But these use cases are gonna have us end up touching a whole bunch of different components in the system. And I think that like going into depth, as much depth as possible in these components and with these personas will be will be like better than having like many use cases personally.
Okay.
Yeah.
So well, at least for February, let's concentrate on these two. Yeah. Getting out as much detail as possible.
Yeah. I'll put a note in the document about some other potential use cases as I hear of them.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if we're aiming for something for KubeCon EU, by March we should have some kind of like proposal for something concrete, and then so that gives us about a month to still like really think about it.
Yeah. So we have about less than 3 months, I think. So that'll be like 10 more meetings. Yeah, we should have something out pretty concrete by then. Okay, by the way, so next week will be the Chinese New Year, so I won't be able to at least actively join the meeting. So could Michael or Torrin help, driving the meeting next week?
Sure, that should be fine.
Yeah.
I did try to add you and Torrin as alternate co-hosts, but I wasn't able to yet. So I'll keep looking to see if there's another way to do that, just so there's a backup in the event that I can't make it.
Yeah. Oh, by the
And
way, we have a Slack channel actually, so
we have a very, very, very quiet Slack channel.
because nobody knows it.
What is
I,
the channel?
it's WG-policy.
Got it.
Are you going to go and blow it up now, Erica? I think all it is like the start, one comment, and then MD Elder joined.
Slack channel is not so sad as an empty Slack.
Fair enough.
Hey. Okay, any final thoughts before we could conclude today's meeting?
I think just Xingyan Kuai Le. Is that close enough? Is that close enough to okay?
Yeah, that's pretty good. So everyone, happy Chinese New Year. I think it's gonna be the dog year or the I don't even know which.
Yep, it's
yeah,
the
we
year
have
of the
like
dog.
12 animals for each year. Well,
everyone loves dogs, so. All right. Have a great New Year.
okay, if there's like no, oh, thank you. So if there are no other business, I think we could conclude the meeting for today. And thanks, Michael, for putting up all these comments. I think we have a lot of stuff done today. So
Absolutely.
I will working on the document and put everything in place for next week's meeting, and I will try to invite my friend. He's in New York, so if he had time next Thursday.
I'm in New York.
Oh, then maybe it's just Torrin on the West Coast.
I
and
think
me on
Khaled
the
and I are
further
both
west.
on East Coast time.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
All right. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
folks.
I'll try to capture and push the recording up.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.